Democrats say that it is racist to believe, well, they say it's racist to do anything. I had a Diet Mountain Dew yesterday and one today. I'm sure they're going to call that racist too, but it's good. I love you guys.
Hello everybody, and welcome back for another episode of Fundy Fridays. If you're new around these parts, my wife, the Reverend Jen, and I, well, on this channel we talk about things like American conservative politics, evangelical Christianity, pop culture, gay stuff, and the way all those things seem to just bump into each other. Like scandals continually pelting a terrible, terrible presidential campaign that never should have come to be in the first place. Also, I want to let you all know that anymore the show is becoming James's show and tell time for shirts he finds at garage and estate sales. This has got little, look at it. It's got little mooses on it, like you can see there, and I feel like it looks good. I like it. It's showing like some collar. I feel like a picture of your dad from the 70s, you know? And y'all are like the only people I talk to anymore anyway, so I'm going to show you the shirts I get. But anyway, speaking of that thing I just said before, today we're here to talk about none other than recently announced Trump vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance. I'm going to be honest, I talk sometimes about, oh, this is a highly requested person, this is a highly requested moment, whatever. I have never, in my time doing Fundy Fridays, had someone requested quite as much as J.D. Vance. He has sparked something in everybody. It seemed like going into this, the first anybody knew of him was when he was being nominated for the second highest office in the land. And obviously, that's the type of thing that's going to stoke a lot of curiosity, right? People are naturally going to be interested in whoever is second in line to the presidency, right? And actually, as I started researching this story, I discovered that the tale of J.D. Vance and how he ended up where he is today is really one of the more fascinating stories I've ever gotten to tell here on Fundy Fridays. Even in the short time he's been in the public spotlight, or compared to a lot of politicians on the planet at all, JD has found himself in a whole gaggle of strange situations and events that I'm just really excited to tell all of you about today. And I'll say the research process for this was really fascinating too, pulling in a lot of different article sources and journalists and videos and a bunch of other stuff that I don't always get to tap into when I'm doing my research, so it was really fun in that regard too. And at the same time, really kind of disheartening, because obviously it involves the Trump campaign, probably the worst thing happening in our country right now, and it's not a story that inspires a lot of hope or good feelings, I'll be the first to admit. But all the same, it's really interesting, and I'm eager to just jump right into it. After all, I did not read J.D. Vance's entire memoir for nothing. Okay, to be fair, I guess I did technically listen to the audiobook version of it, actually. And that reminds me, today's video is brought to you all by Raycon. Today's episode is sponsored by Raycon Everyday Earbuds. Right now, all of you can click the link in the description box below or go to buyraycon.com/fundy to get 20 to 40% off your Raycon purchase. Plus, free shipping. Now, in order to do the research for my episode today, I had to read JD's famous book, and I decided to listen to the audiobook on my Raycon Everyday Earbuds in Blush Violet. I decided to listen to it because, well, I had some really important work that also had to get done at the same time, okay? Look, that's not important. The important thing is, my Raycon Everyday Earbuds made the experience incredibly enjoyable, or at least as enjoyable as JD's book could possibly be. Our Raycon Everyday Earbuds even came complete with this Dreamy Clouds carrying case. I mean, look, it's so dreamy. It makes you want to just drift on away to dreamland, although that might be because JD's book was really boring. I honestly don't know. They fit really comfortably and ergonomically in my ear, and they even came with 5 different size options for the silicone gel tips. So once these earbuds are tucked into your ear holes, they aren't going anywhere, no matter how rigorous the activity. And boy, do these babies charge quick too. With just 10 minutes on the charger, you'll get 90 usable minutes of Raycon earbud time. It's perfect for all of my childless cat husband activities, like meowing the lawn. Raycon's everyday earbuds also have active noise cancellation and I was able to listen to JD talk on and on for hours with perfect audio clarity. Did you know JD actually narrated his own audiobook? Because I do. Oh, and one more thing I love about my Raycon everyday earbuds in blush violet is that they feature multi-point connectivity, meaning that they can partner to 2 different devices at once. So Jen could listen along to JD's audiobook too if she wanted to. I mean, she doesn't want to, but you know, she could, and that's what's important. You all can click the link in the description below or go to buyraycon.com/Fundy to get 20 to 40% off your Raycon purchase, plus free shipping. And now, back to the video. Now, as we start talking about JD's early life, I do want to preface this by saying that most of the information you're about to hear, I mean most of the information you're about to hear, comes from JD's highly successful 2016 memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which is in fact the first way a lot of people got introduced to JD at all. Now, as I mentioned before, I listened to the audiobook version of it, which is narrated by JD himself, because I felt like that was the most authentic version of the experience. And also because it allowed me to play the new College Football 25 game that just came out that I've been waiting about 15 years for at the same time. FYI, it took me about a season and a half or so of my Brigham Young University dynasty to get through the entire book. And I swear, it felt like JD was there in the room with me, telling me his life story while I played my game, which I feel the need to clarify was not a pleasant feeling whatsoever. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the book itself and its cultural impact and how it plays into JD's life a little bit later on in the story. But I just wanted to highlight up front that most of the information we're about to hear comes from the book, and to express to you all that I did read the book because I feel like that's kind of my job. I was supposed to read it so y'all didn't have to. But anyway, J.D. Vance was born in Middletown, Ohio on August 2nd of 1984. Now, in all of his public engagements, his political life, basically everything he does, JD will reference this time in his life, his young life, spent in rural Appalachian, Ohio. But I do want to clarify that when he's talking about Appalachia, he's actually kind of talking about 2 different places. One of them is Middletown, Ohio, where he was born and raised, but the other one is Jackson, Kentucky, which is where a lot of his family is from and where he spent some visiting time in his youth, and where he still seems to visit and be connected today. Moving on to JD's family, let's first talk about his mother, Beverly Vance, or Bev for short, as you might expect. Through Hillbilly Elegy, we found that JD's mother, Bev, struggled throughout his young life with serious drug addiction and mental health issues, and often acted abusively towards him and his older sister, Lindsay, and throughout the book was generally never presented as a stable caregiver.
We got on the highway and I said something that ignited her temper. So she sped up to what seemed like 100 miles per hour and told me that she was going to crash the car and kill us both. I jumped into the back seat, thinking that if I could use 2 seatbelts at once, I'd be more likely to survive the impact. This infuriated her more, so she pulled over to beat the shit out of me.
As we'll come to find out, though, like every other Hillbilly Elegy character, though, Bev is, for the most part, treated with a pretty reasonable degree of nuance and respect, even when at times she may not necessarily deserve it. For example, JD also highlights that Bev was a registered nurse, the salutatorian of her high school class, and consistently an eager supporter of whatever endeavors JD found himself in. And likewise, by all recent accounts, JD has made up with his mother in the past few years, and now she serves as a fixture on his various campaign trails.
Our movement is about single moms like mine, who struggled with money and addiction, but never gave up. And I'm proud to say that tonight my mom is here, 10 years clean and sober. I love you, Mom.
Now, JD's bio dad, a man named Donald Ray Bowman, who was also Bev's second husband, he wasn't initially in the picture in JD's life, although they did reconnect somewhat in JD's teenage years, particularly after Donald had found Christ. But overall, boyfriends and stepdads never really stayed for very long. Interestingly, JD was actually born James Donald Bowman in reference to his biological father, but his name would later be changed by Bev after she married her third husband to James David Hamill. Though she would divorce Bob Hamill, the husband with whom this name is associated, relatively quickly into the marriage, the name, it appears, would stick for much longer than the marriage would. Now, JD was primarily raised by his maternal grandparents, who he refers to almost exclusively as Mamaw and Papaw. Papaw, or what I would call Grandpa, James Lee Vance, he's portrayed throughout the book as a caring and positive masculine presence throughout JD's young life, though he died when JD was relatively young. However, JD also details Papaw's drinking problem that plagued his mother Bev's youth and which led to a significant amount of household instability and extreme violence.
Mamaw told Papaw after a particularly violent night of drinking that if he ever came home drunk again, she'd kill him. A week later, he came home drunk again and fell asleep on the couch. Mamaw, never one to tell a lie, calmly retrieved a gasoline canister from the garage, poured it all over her husband, lit a match, and dropped it on his chest. When Papaw burst into flames, their 11-year-old daughter jumped into action to put out the fire and save his life. Miraculously, Papaw survived the episode with only mild burns.
Now, Bonnie Vance, maiden name Blanton, and called, again, almost exclusively throughout the book as Mamaw, well, she is far and away the most important caregiver to JD in his young life. And she is the person with whom he credits most of his success today. Now, tragically, she passed away in 2005, but when reading the book and in general just listening to anything JD says in regards to her, you can tell that she has left an incredible lasting mark on him. Now, one thing you need to know about Mamaw is that she swore like a sailor. It's a big part of her personality, and truth be told anymore, I think that JD kind of highlights it to make Trump's vulgarness seem a little bit less problematic, which is insulting to Mamaw to say the least, in my opinion. Likewise, Mamaw is portrayed in the book as being pretty violent and sometimes pretty mean. But once again, she was still presented as JD's primary and most important caregiver throughout his entire childhood. And in regards to JD, at least, she was presented as a kind and nurturing figure, with an exceptionally strong bond to JD himself, despite what her harsh demeanor and raunchy vocabulary may lead you to believe.
Mamaw raised me as my mother struggled with addiction. Mamaw was in so many ways a woman of contradiction. She loved the Lord, ladies and gentlemen. She was a woman of very deep Christian faith. But she also loved the F word. I'm not kidding. She could make a sailor blush. Now, she once told me, when she found out that I was spending too much time with a local kid who was known for dealing drugs, that if I ever hung out with that kid again, she would run him over with her car.
Now, to be honest, as someone like JD, whose grandmother was heavily involved in his upbringing, I really appreciate how much he talks about her and the way he talks about her. You can tell that Mamaw Bonnie really cared about JD, and I don't want to say anything bad about her. Likewise, you can tell that JD went out of his way to make Mamaw the most sympathetic and admirable character in the entire book. He's very quick and very careful to contextualize any of Mamaw's rough behavior, highlighting consistently that she was mean and aggressive because she had to be growing up, and to contextualize all of her behavior in the context of this difficult upbringing, rather than attributing any negative thing she does to something that could be construed as a character flaw. But to be honest, that's probably how I'd write about my grandma too, so I can't say nothing.
Mamaw Bonnie herself was so terrifying that many decades later, a Marine Corps recruiter would tell me that I'd find boot camp easier than living at home. That meanness wasn't enough to dissuade my grandfather, so Mamaw and Papaw were married as teenagers in Jackson in 1947. Hillbilly culture at the time, and maybe now, blended a robust sense of honor, devotion to family, and bizarre sexism into a sometimes explosive mix. Before Mamaw was married, her brothers had been willing to murder boys who disrespected their sister. Now that she was married to a man whom many of them considered more a brother than an outsider, they tolerated behavior that would have gotten Papaw killed in the holler. Mom's brothers would come up and want to go carousing with Dad, Uncle Jimmy explained. They'd go drinking and chasing women. Mamaw felt disloyalty acutely. She loathed anything that smacked of a lack of complete devotion to family. In her own home, she'd say things like, "I'm sorry I'm so damn mean," and "You know I love you, but I'm just a crazy bitch."
Anyway, moving on, the rest of Hillbilly Elegy just kind of details JD's life from birth all the way to the present time, and at least when he wrote it and published it, which was the summer of 2016. But I really want to go in chronological order today. So for the purposes of our story, I'll just say that despite all of the difficulty and turbulence in his upbringing, JD clearly survived it and did manage to graduate high school in 2003, which he reports in the book was no easy process given all of the difficulties he was facing at home and thusly in school. Now, he would end up considering college for a little while before getting apparently freaked out by the student loans and deciding instead to enlist with the Marines, which will take us to the next chapter of our story. Now, for JD, the Marines were seen as both a really effective way to find structure as an adult coming out of an extremely unstructured childhood, and also as an effective path to upward mobility for a kid coming from rural generational poverty. JD would spend his time in the Marine Corps working as a non-combat field correspondent, documenting various Marine activities for PR purposes, and still in fact has 4 photographs listed on the official military archive to this day, some of which you can see here now. Notably though, at least in my opinion, JD seems to present as being very nonchalant about his time in the military. He doesn't talk very much about it. It doesn't get referenced too awful much. Even in Hillbilly Elegy, he talks a lot more about the time from his childhood rather than anything he did in the military. He has a whole chapter about the military, but it's just not brought up as much as you might expect. I suspect that might be because it was a non-combat, almost kind of artsy role, and he may not engage with it much because it's not popular with the MAGA crowd. I don't know. It's giving Micro, I was in the opera for 8 whole years, but it was stupid and I didn't do anything important. It's really, I don't know, it's strange. Because it is impressive to be a Marine correspondent. That's an impressive thing. Anyway, more important about this military service is that it gave JD access to the GI Bill to fund his college education, which he would receive from the Ohio State University in 2009 in the form of a bachelor's in political science. Notably, this was also where JD seems to have gotten his first taste of electoral politics when he spent a period working for Ohio Republican State Senator Bob Schuler. And then from there, JD would take his talents to the extremely prestigious Yale Law School. And in my opinion, more important than anything else about his experience at Yale were the sheer number and impact of the connections he made while attending that school. For example is Jamil Javani. Basically the J.D. Vance of Canada. He's currently a far-right MP in the Canadian Parliament, also came from a rough background. He's kind of a soft-spoken, hardline conservative, and a party young gun with appeal across the aisle. Seriously, they're the same frickin' guy. Likewise, there was Amy Chua, a faculty member of JD's and successful author of Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, her own controversial memoir. And as you might expect, she was one of the first people to encourage JD in writing his book. And generally speaking, she also had a similar career trajectory as JD and formed kind of a special bond with him between professor and student.
When I was a student at Yale Law School, what did you think about me and why did you encourage me to write this book?
So I met JD his very first day of law school. He was one of maybe 70 students in my contracts class. I remember he sat in the very, very back row. He was a tall guy, stood out. I think JD and I clicked from the very beginning. It's really interesting. I've said this on the record. Superficially, it would seem like we have nothing in common. I'm the daughter of Chinese immigrants. Both my parents have graduate degrees. But I always felt like an outsider growing up, which is why I'm so interested in tribalism and identity and cultures. So JD and I bonded. I remember we had so much weird stuff in common. A little bit of not liking pretentiousness. We remembered eat all you can buffets. We both lack some impulse control. We just had lots of views in common.
Now, more importantly, he also met Usha Chillicurry, who now goes by Usha Vance because she is his wife. See, Usha came from a very different set of circumstances than JD. Her parents, for example, were Indian immigrants, practicing Hindus, and upper middle class professionals with robust academic backgrounds in things like engineering and biology. Likewise, she grew up in the San Diego Bay Area, specifically in the wealthy suburb of Rancho Penasquitos. Not to be confused with Rancho Carne, the high school famous for America's second best cheerleading team.
Hate us 'cause we're beautiful, well we don't like you either, we're cheerleaders.
Except, wait. That was a Bring It On joke, but it turns out that parts of the movie were actually filmed at Usha's own Mount Carmel High School. So yeah, as far as I'm concerned, she went to Rancho Carne. But anyway, Usha's path through college was also dramatically different from JD's. After graduating from Rancho Carne, she jumped straight into Yale for undergrad, then to Cambridge for a spell before going back to Yale for law school. Now, reportedly, Usha kind of mentored JD in college on the confusing middle and upper class social norms that he didn't learn coming from a youth spent in rural poverty. Meaning that she really is a central figure in his success going all the way back to the earliest days. I really just want to give this woman her credit.
I looked down at the place setting and observed an absurd number of instruments. 9 utensils? Why, I wondered, did I need 3 spoons? Why were there multiple butter knives? Then I recalled a scene from a movie and realized there was some social convention surrounding the placement and size of the cutlery. I excused myself to the restroom and called my spirit guide. What do I do with all these damn forks? I don't want to make a fool of myself. Armed with Usha's reply, go from outside to inside, and don't use the same utensil for separate dishes. Oh, and use the fat spoon for soup. I returned to dinner, ready to dazzle my future employers.
And up until very recently, she was a practicing attorney for Munger, Tolles & Olson, one of the most prestigious and, oddly enough, one of the most progressive law firms in the entire country. Now, no matter how terrible JD becomes later on, and he's going to become pretty terrible, I do want to say that Usha seems to have been a very positive influence and a good partner to him, helping to pull JD into the upper middle class fold that he would come to build his life and career around. And as I mentioned, they got married specifically in 2014, and very specifically in a lovely interfaith ceremony, highlighting that JD was particularly supportive of his wife's Hinduism, and she is still Hindu to this day, in fact. Oh, and this is also where both JD and Usha would take on the surname Vance in honor of JD's Mamaw. So yeah, I like to believe that JD's wife was an overall positive influence on him. So to balance everything out, let's talk about a really, really negative influence on JD, in the form of a man named Peter Thiel. Now I'm going to tell you all right now, Peter Thiel will be coming up a lot in this story, and actually, just a little bit of a spoiler, he's going to be coming up in at least one more episode I do later on this year. But for now, I'm just going to kind of give you the highlight reel version. Long story very short, Peter Thiel is a massively wealthy and incredibly successful venture capitalist. He's also openly gay.
I am proud to be gay. I am proud to be a Republican. But most of all, I am proud to be an American.
He's also a devout Christian, the slayer of Gawker, a libertarian conservative activist and kind of separatist, and Republican Party mega donor, who himself has a long and storied history of expressing extremely right-wing opinions online. I mean, good lord, he was saying stuff like this as far back as 2009. Now, Peter made his fortune being, among other things, a founder of PayPal alongside both Elon Musk and Luke Nosek, who longtime Genonites may recall as one of the principal funders behind Angel Studios. And what's more, Peter was also the first outside investor for a little website called Facebook, all the way back in 2004. Also, and this is just James kind of riffing to the camera, and this is my own little pet conspiracy theory about Peter Thiel. I suspect that Peter Thiel massively underreports his wealth online. I mean, he reports having just $7 billion to his name. I know that's an ungodly amount of money, but for someone like Peter Thiel, it's downright meager. And personally, I think it's reasonable to believe he probably has access to much more hidden wealth thanks to his just incredible track record of business and stock market success. But unlike some other pop star impregnating, brain chip implanting, terrible truck making former business partners of his, I personally also suspect that Teal practices some stealth wealth and tones things down when he reports stuff to avoid public suspicion. Not to mention it keeps the guillotine crowd off of his neck, pun very much intended. Now, per JD's post at the Catholic lifestyle magazine The Lamp, he first met Peter Thiel at a guest lecture he gave at Yale in 2011, and then, per Stephanie Saul at New York Times, from there he systematically tracked down an email address for Thiel on Google and threw a Hail Mary trying to get in touch with the guy, which apparently worked, and then the two have been close contacts ever since. JD and Thiel also seem to have a mentor-mentee kind of relationship when it comes to broader political philosophy, in that they both specifically subscribe to a lot of the far-right anti-democratic ideologies that one can unfortunately see festering all over the internet anymore. Sometimes referred to online as the Dark Enlightenment movement, JD and Peter Thiel both seem to particularly subscribe to some of the more intense views even within this already intense subculture, like those of mutual friend Curtis Yarvin, a far-right philosophical blogger known more commonly online by the moniker Mencius Moldbug for some reason I honestly don't want to know. He's also, and I'm not kidding when I say this, probably the person who first coined the term red-pilled, as you can see from this strange-ass blog of his, complete with perhaps the most unhinged introduction I've ever seen. Welcome to Unqualified Reservations. Unqualified Reservations is a strange blog. Its goal is to cure your brain. We've all seen The Matrix. We know about red pills. Many claim to sell them. You can go, for example, to any bookstore and ask the guy behind the counter for some Noam Chomsky. What you'll get is blue pills soaked in red number 3. Since we provide the genuine article, Unqualified Reservations is pretty much the anti-Chomsky. As a broad generalization, Unqualified Reservations' stance in any controversy will be the opposite of Chomsky's. Take one of our red pills, heck, split one in half, and you'll be in a completely different world. Disrespectfully, what the fuck was that? Now, Yarvin also founded, at least with Peter Thiel's money, a startup called Urbit, which seems to be some kind of important computer programming thing that honestly I read about several times and still could not describe to you all if I tried. But more prominently, he's known for the many, many blog posts he's made on unqualified reservations chronicling his disdain for modern oligarchy in the US, and how he feels the best way to solve that problem is with the installation of a CEO-like dictator, preferably someone from the tech sector with an entrepreneurial bent.
And finally, you need a CEO, and a national CEO is what's called a dictator. It's the same thing. There's no difference between a CEO and a dictator. If Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over their dictator phobia.
Seriously though, Yarvin has even laid out an entire roadmap for how he thinks that this plan should be accomplished. Specifically using a right-wing presidential candidate who promises to use absolute authority to clean up the government however he sees fit, all the while keeping the American left so disillusioned with politics in general that they just kind of let it happen. And then once in power, you just label anybody who opposes this dictator-like figure as a useless bureaucrat and get them out to be replaced with a loyal sycophant who won't argue with anything you do, giving said dictator figure an unparalleled opportunity to make whatever changes they can imagine to our broader society without any of that pesky opposition nonsense. Even as a fun little acronym for it, RAGE.
So, obviously, a very complicated problem. So, I like to simplify things. So, I've reduced this very complicated problem to a simple 4-letter acronym, which is RAGE. And RAGE stands for Retire All Government Employees. Very Very, very simple.
This dude is weird. Like, can we agree with that? I ain't even done, y'all. Like, let's keep going. Because Yarvin also believes that the U.S. is controlled by something he calls the Cathedral, which is just his nickname for a loose amalgamation of educational institutions, media conglomerates, and other proponents of quote-unquote woke ideology who suppress freedom of thought and technological innovation by over-concerning themselves with the fate of society's most vulnerable citizens.
And so the cathedral concept, I think you wrote about it in 2008.
Something like that, yes.
And in your recent piece in Grey Mirror, you described it as basically journalism plus academia, all the intellectual institutions at the center, at the heart of modern society, sort of like how the church was, but now it leans progressive and woke.
And it's decentralized.
Mm-hmm.
People sort of trust these institutions because of their polycentric nature, and yet you don't see them drifting apart from each other in any sense. You see them drifting only closer and closer together. So Harvard does not move right while the Yale moves left. The Washington Post does not move right while the New York Times moves left. They're all drifting over time. They're all drifting in the same direction, and they're all just drifting sort of closer and closer to us, to each other.
And also, as you might have pieced together by now, Curtis Yarvin is super racist. We can see a little bit more of Yarvin's racism come through in this fantastic article from Chris Lehman at The Nation. And more specifically, we can see it in his quotation of writer Corey Pean from publication The Baffler. I am not a white nationalist, but I do read white nationalist blogs, and I'm not afraid to link to them. I'm not exactly allergic to the stuff, Yarvin writes. He also praises a blogger who advocated the deportation of Muslims and the closure of mosques as, quote-unquote, probably the most imaginative and interesting right-wing writer on the planet. Hectoring a Swarthmore history professor, Yarvin rhapsodizes on colonial rule in southern Africa and suggests that black people had it better under apartheid. If you ask me to condemn mass murderer Anders Breivik, but adore Nelson Mandela, perhaps you have a mother Nope, I'm not finishing that. His jargon may be novel, but whenever Mencius Moldbug descends to the realm of the concrete, he offers familiar tropes of white victimhood. Yarvin's favorite author, the 19th century writer Scott Thomas Carlyle, is perhaps best known for his infamous slavery apologia, Occasional Discourse on a Thing I Don't Want to Say. If there is one writer in English whose name can be uttered with Shakespeare's, it is Carlyle, Yarvin writes. Later in the same essay, Yarvin calls slavery a quote-unquote natural human relationship, akin to that of patron and client. So yeah, he's weird and also trash. Now, Yarvin has expressed an interest in utilizing the Trump campaign in particular to see through his vision of installing a bold, consequential dictatorship through which positive change can be made somehow. I don't know. Truthfully, he doesn't go into that part in detail ever. And since I'm clearly having trouble climbing out of this Curtis Yarvin rabbit hole, let's take a look at this clip of JD applying his terrible and terrifying ideas into practice, and hopefully that'll help us get back on track.
You know, there's this guy Curtis Yarvin who's written about some of these things. And so one is to basically accept that this entire thing is going to fall in on itself, right? And so the task of conservatives right now is to preserve as much as can be preserved. And then when the inevitable collapse of the country comes, ensure that conservatives are able to sort of help build back the country in a way that's actually better, not Joe Biden's build back better, but actually some sort of reconstruction of the country. I think that's too pessimistic and too defeatist. I tend to think that we should seize the institutions of the left and turn them against the left, right? We need like a de-Bathification program, but like a de-wokeification program in the United States, right?
But I do know that this is where J.D. Vance comes back into our story. Because while I'm sitting here talking about all of the influences and connections he made in college, and with all the help he had along the way, it must be said that J.D. was a successful student in his own right, including a brief turn as an editor for the prestigious Yale Law Review. But generally speaking, it seems like overall he was disinterested in the mundane practice of courtroom law. But all the same, in 2013, JD would graduate from Yale with his Juris Doctor, and for the next 3 years after that would seem to take on a variety of prestigious yet ultimately mundane and underwhelming legal-esque type jobs. For example, he was a legal clerk for Texas Senator John Cornyn, a legal clerk for U.S. District Judge David Bunning, and a practicing attorney for prestigious law firm Sidley Austin, which itself is famous for being the same law firm at which Barack and Michelle Obama first met. And when I say reuniting with Teal, I mean reuniting in a big way, becoming an investment partner at Teal's venture capital firm, Mithril Capital. Now, colleagues at Mithril Capital state that for the most part it seemed like JD was rarely there. But the thing is, we know people in positions like this get paid the big bucks, right? And I mean, presumably JD wouldn't have gone to San Francisco and worked this job and done all of this for nothing. So why was JD being paid by Peter Thiel if not to be an active investment partner? Well, to answer that question, let's move on ahead to the next chapter of our story. So yeah, as far as I can tell, Peter Thiel basically just paid JD to finish and start promoting this book. Likely in an effort to lay the foundation for a lot of what we're about to talk about. Published during the summer of 2016, Hillbilly Elegy details JD's tumultuous young life in Middletown, Ohio, as we've talked about, in deep and visceral detail. The book itself is a staunch and direct portrayal of things like American poverty, Appalachian economic decay, rural and middle American political disenchantment, mental health service gaps, chronic drug addiction, and generational trauma.
Why the book?
Well, I thought that I could add something useful to this conversation we were having in the country and still having in the country about upward mobility and why we don't have more of it, why there aren't more poor kids who are able to achieve the American dream. And so, in my view, the best way to accomplish that, to tell a compelling story, but hopefully also make a compelling argument, is to make the book not just about sort of the abstract sociological and economic argument, but to make it very personally about my life. So in some ways, it is a bit absurd to write a book about yourself when you're only 31 years old. I'm 32 now. But hopefully I've added something to this conversation.
But we also have to acknowledge that a fair amount of the book's success also came from, for lack of better phrasing, a healthy dose of good old-fashioned sensationalism. It's not for the faint of heart. It's got, like we've said, some pretty stark portrayals of child abuse, domestic violence, and truth be told, honestly, just some strange violence that itself is hard to categorize.
Or there was the day when Uncle T-Berry overheard a young man state a desire to eat her panties, a reference to his sister's, my Mamaw's, undergarments. Uncle T-Berry drove home, retrieved a pair of Mamaw's underwear, and forced the young man, at knife point, to consume the clothing.
However, Hillbilly Elegy is also notable for just how sympathetically JD portrays the people from this time in his life. Every act of violence is met with heaps of context and explanation, particularly if it's an act of violence being perpetrated by a member of his family.
Young Jimmy stood outside in the cold until Mamaw and Papaw strolled by and asked if he'd like to go inside the pharmacy. I can't, Jimmy told his father. Why? That man got mad at me and told me to leave. I'm not allowed to go back inside. Mamaw and Papaw stormed in, demanding an explanation for the clerk's rudeness. The clerk explained that Jimmy had been playing with an expensive toy. This toy? Papaw asked, picking up the toy. When the clerk nodded, Papaw smashed it on the ground. Utter chaos ensued. As Uncle Jimmy explained, they went nuts. Dad threw another one of the toys across the store and moved toward the clerk in a very menacing way. Mom started grabbing random shit off the shelves and throwing it all over the place. She's screaming, "Kick his fucking ass! Kick his fucking ass!" So yes, even in their best times, Mamaw and Papaw struggled to adapt. Middletown was a different world. Papaw was supposed to go to work and complained politely to management about rude pharmacy employees. Mamaw was expected to cook dinner, do laundry, and take care of the children. But sewing circles, picnics, and door-to-door vacuum salesmen were not suited to a woman who had almost killed a man at the tender age of 12.
And even in the parts of the book where he's surrounded by all the pretentious upper-middle-class liberals at Yale, JD's quick to point out how many friends he had at this point in his life. And not to mention all the minds he changed along the way about people like him. I guess we should also note here that while the book does in a lot of spots seem to try and reach across the political aisle, so to speak, and particularly addresses how both major political parties have failed Americans from this part of the country, it also must be said that Hillbilly Elegy maintains a distinctly conservative bent throughout. and particularly finds some very libertarian ways to individualize rural economic strife. This concept was addressed particularly well, in my opinion, by Sarah Jones at the New Republic. Elegy is little more than a list of myths about welfare queens repackaged as a primer on the white working class. Vance's central argument is that hillbillies themselves are to blame for their troubles. Our religion has changed, he laments, to a version heavy on emotional rhetoric and light on the kind of social support that he needed as a child. He also faults a peculiar crisis of masculinity. This brave new world, in sore need of that old-time religion and manly men, is apparently to blame for everything from his mother's drug addiction to the region's economic crisis. We spend our way to the poorhouse, he writes. We buy giant TVs and iPads. Our children wear nice clothes thanks to high-interest credit cards and payday loans. We purchase homes we don't need, refinance them for more spending money, and declare bankruptcy, often leaving them full of garbage in our wake. Thrift is inimical to our being, and he isn't interested in government solutions. All hillbillies need to do is work hard, maybe do a stint in the military, and they can end up at Yale Law School like he did. Public policy can help, JD writes, but there is no government that can fix these problems for us. It starts when we stop blaming Obama or Bush or faceless companies and ask ourselves, what can we do to make things better? Now, that's particularly kind of ironic because later on in the book, he actually goes on to praise payday loan companies for being like a great resource for poor people. So stick to a stupid story, JD. But in the end, regardless of anyone's opinion about the book, what is absolutely true is that Hillbilly Elegy became an overnight sensation, leaping onto both the New York Times and Amazon bestseller lists and staying there for years. Much of this success is now attributed to a viral interview for the American Conservative website with right-wing writer Rod Dreher, another close friend and philosophical inspiration of JD's, not unlike Teal or Yarvin. Dreher is famous for his philosophical musings on the idea of conservative Christian dissidence, often encouraging Christians to embrace rejection by larger society and take on a role as righteous objectors / pious examples to a society in moral decline. Getting back to JD, though, in this viral interview, he's really given room to soft launch his newest political persona, namely a right-leaning voice of moderate reason who could clearly articulate Middle America's fascination with 2016 presidential candidate Donald Trump in a way confused coastal liberals could easily digest. At the same time, though, at least during this point in his career, JD was also just as quick to highlight his disdain for Trump's blatant lies, gross behavior, and divisive rhetoric. And while I know he may not want it brought up today, at least at this point in his career, JD Vance absolutely identified as a never-Trumper.
Well, you think about the slogan, "Make America Great Again." The implication is that America isn't great right now, and if you're very unhappy about your life, that's going to resonate.
Do you think this is enough people to elect Donald Trump?
No, I don't think it's a large enough people to elect Donald Trump. My fear is, I think Donald Trump is not the right candidate for this group of voters. I think that this election is really having a negative effect, especially on the white working class, right? Because I think a lot of these grievances are legitimate, but what it's doing is it's giving people an excuse to point the finger at someone else. It's point the finger at Mexican immigrants or Chinese trade or the Democratic elites or whatever else. And sometimes these villains are legitimate. I think it's totally fair to say that the policy elites of the Democratic Party haven't been totally concerned about the white working class. But at the same time, fundamentally what's going on and what Donald Trump has done is change the focus of the white working class from a sort of engaged and constructive politics to a politics of pointing the finger. I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him. The problem is, if you take that attitude of sort of gloating over Trump's defeat, then you're playing into the very thing that gave rise to Trump in the first place, which is a feeling that the elites think that they're smarter than you and just think you're a bunch of idiots.
Now from here, JD would parlay this initial meteoric literary success into a short-lived run as a kind of talking head for news networks, frequently joining hosts from both sides of the American political spectrum to discuss his book, rural politics, and the rise of Donald Trump. Now, by all accounts, this brief foray into the world of political punditry went pretty well for JD, and would see him move from mere political commentary and towards more direct political action. Just one day after the 2016 presidential election, JD founded Our Ohio Renewal, a vaguely purposed community restoration charity meant to try and address all the Appalachian social ills discussed in Hillbilly Elegy. Reports indicate that the charity's only notable success was sending a single addiction psychiatrist to some vague part of Appalachia for a single-year residency. Oh, and she also had major financial ties to the manufacturers of OxyContin. So... Oh, and also, later reports indicate that most of the charity's funding went to consulting fees for one of JD's top campaign advisors. So... Either way, though, by early 2017, JD had also relocated back to Ohio from San Francisco. And by 2018, he was considered a prime candidate to run in that year's Senate election against Ohio incumbent Sherrod Brown. He would ultimately bow out of this endeavor for the time, though, citing the very reasonable desire to stay with his growing young family, and more interestingly, I think, to commit more energy to his newest startup venture, which is as good a time as any to go ahead and move us to a new chapter. Yeah, see, during what was essentially this long-ass press tour for Hillbilly Elegy, JD never actually stopped working in the world of venture capital. In 2017, he even changed jobs, jumping from Mithril Capital to Revolution LLC, another venture capital firm, this time headed up by America Online co-founder and also billionaire Steve Case. Specifically, JD was put in charge of Case's Rise of the Rest initiative, a program which sought to offer capital investment opportunities to startups and entrepreneurs outside of the New York and Silicon Valley hotspots. And hey, check it out, in this video you can actually see a little cameo from a young JD Vance. He's right there! It's like Where's Waldo if Where's Waldo sucked. Now, credit where it's due. Reports indicate the program to have been a big success while JD was there, raising millions in startup capital from a pretty wide variety of big money investors. Now, as far as I could tell, JD worked with Rise of the Rest until about 2019, when he would venture off, pun very much intended, and found his own firm, Narya Venture Capital. Headquartered in JD's home state of Ohio, Narya's stated goal was to offer high-value venture capital investment opportunities to startups located in and bringing jobs or income to Appalachia. And this wasn't some fly-by-night operation either. Reports indicate that utilizing the power of his Teal connections, JD raised nearly $100 million in startup funds by the end of the year. And JD's personal life would also be shaken up in 2019 as well, specifically when he converted from a very loose, disconnected brand of evangelical Christianity to become an extremely tight and connected traditional Catholic. And see, it's in this part of the story where I think we can most clearly see JD starting to transition into the next phase of his professional life. Namely, moving from Silicon Valley's big money Appalachian sweetheart and MSNBC's favorite in-house Trump translator to a full-fledged MAGA conservative and rising star of the GOP. And we'll go ahead and take a look at that in our next chapter. See, the thing is, JD has talked about his conversion to Catholicism online so much by this point that we can actually use it all to show the decline of his political views in real time. For example, we have yet another interview with JD from Rod Dreher, with JD discussing his conversion to Catholicism literally on the same day in which he took his first communion. And at least at this point, and in my opinion, JD's approach to his faith is relatively subdued, especially compared to what we're gonna see later on. Dreher asks, "Why Catholicism? Why now?" And JD responds, "Well, I became persuaded over time that Catholicism was true. I was raised Christian, but never had a super strong attachment to any denomination, and was never baptized. When I became more interested in faith, I started out with a clean slate and looked at the church that appealed to me most intellectually. But it's too easy to intellectualize this. When I looked at the people who meant the most to me, they were Catholic. My uncle by marriage is a Catholic. René Girard, someone I only knew by reading him, well, he was a Catholic. I've been reading and studying about it for 3 years or even longer. It was time. It probably would have happened sooner if the sex abuse crisis, or the newest version of it, hadn't made a lot of headlines. It forced me to process the church as a divine and human institution, and what it would mean for my 2-year-old son. But I never really questioned over the past few years that I would become Catholic. Did anybody else note how he just completely sidestepped the whole massive sex abuse scandal question? Just it was right there and he went right around it. Now, to be fair, by this point, JD was fully identifying as a Republican and a social conservative. And he wasn't shy about acknowledging how those things played out in his conversion. To what extent do you expect your Catholic faith to guide your views on public policy? My views on public policy and what the optimal state should look like are pretty aligned with the Catholic social teaching. That was one of the things that drew me to the Catholic Church. I saw a real overlap between what I would like to see and what the Catholic Church would like to see. I hope my faith makes me more compassionate and to identify with people who are struggling, but my politics have been pretty consistent over the past few years. I think the Republican Party has been too long a partnership between social conservatives and market libertarians, and I don't think social conservatives have benefited too much from that partnership. Part of social conservatism's challenge for viability in the 21st century is that it can't just be about issues like abortion, but it has to have a broader vision of political economy and the common good. And yeah, see, overall, it's pretty obvious at this point that he's still trying to hold on to at least some of his bipartisan appeal. What are the chief spiritual dangers you perceive for committed Christians in political life and in the current movement? Well, at a fundamental level, being in public life is in part a popularity contest. When you're trying to do things that make you liked by as many people as possible, you're not likely to do things that are consistent with the teachings of the Catholic Church. I'm a Christian and a conservative and a Republican, so I have definite views about what that means. But you have to be humble and realize that politics are essentially a temporal game. I know a lot of people are very critical of how a majority of self-described Christians have approached Trump. To me, fundamentally, the issue that most Christians confront is, which of these two political parties is the least offensive to my faith? When that's the question, the answer is almost always going to be unsatisfactory. I am definitely critical of the way some evangelicals have reacted to the president, but I also know that most of them aren't doing it because they're sycophants. They're doing it because they don't think they have a better option. But moving into 2020, the tone surrounding how JD's conversion is talked about, well, it seems to change a little bit. As we can see in this editorial post he made once again for The Lamp, and specifically for their Easter issue that year. I mean, the title alone gives us an idea that this is probably going to be a bit more confrontational of an affair than the last article we looked at. And trust me when I say, the differences go past the cover, too. This post from JD is a dense essay of the philosophical musings and other various motivations that would eventually push him towards traditional Catholicism. He highlights various things like the church's focus on community and active participation, their support for young families, so forth and so on. You can kind of figure it out from there. But most telling, in my opinion, is when JD provides the reader with a passage from St. Augustine's The City of God. I'm not going to read this passage directly because it's long and it's boring, but essentially it begins with some very reasonable criticisms concerning oligarchy and the delegation of social power, and ends with the author complaining about sex workers and loud music in public. To JD, though, this ancient retelling of Old Man Yells at Cloud was apparently the smartest thing he'd ever heard in his life. It was the best criticism of our modern age I'd ever read. A society oriented entirely towards consumption and pleasure, spurning duty and virtue. Not long after I first read these words, my friend Orrin Cass published a book arguing that American policymakers have focused far too much on promoting consumption as opposed to productivity or some other measure of well-being. The reaction, criticizing Orrin for daring to push policies that might lower consumption, almost proved the argument. Yes, I found myself saying, Orrin's preferred policies might reduce per capita consumption, but that's precisely the point. Our society is more than the sum of its economic statistics. If people die sooner in the midst of historic levels of consumption, then perhaps our focus on consumption is misguided. And indeed, it was this insight, more than any other, that ultimately led not just to Christianity, but to Catholicism. Despite my Mamaw's unfamiliarity with the liturgy, the Roman and Italian cultural influences, and the foreign pope, I slowly began to see Catholicism as the closest expression of her kind of Christianity, obsessed with virtue, but cognizant of the fact that virtue is formed in the context of a broader community, sympathetic with the meek and poor of the world without treating them primarily as victims, protective of children and families, and with the things necessary to ensure they thrive. And above all, a faith centered around a Christ who demands perfection of us even as he loves unconditionally and forgives easily. So, with virtue obsession apparently being a good thing, acknowledging the victimhood of the poor being a bad thing, and the noticeable dash of persecution complex mixed into the whole thing, I think we can all kind of see where this is going. Not that we really need to, though, since by 2021, JD had basically given up the goat entirely and let everyone know, yeah, this conversion is all about the politics, as we can see in this clip from that year's national conference for the Napa Institute, a conservative Catholic think tank.
So you were raised a non-denominational Christian. I understand you were never baptized. You've also said you went through an angry atheist phase, as you called it. But in 2019, you took the plunge, and you were received into the Catholic Church. Tell us about that journey.
Well, first, it's good to be home, and I do think the Catholic Church is my home. I think that at Yale Law School, where I went to law school, is all about get the best degree, go to the best school, get the best job, and these things weren't making me a good person, but Christianity was asking me to ask much more important questions, like how do you treat this girl that you've fallen in love with, the girl that I eventually married? How do you be a good person? How do you eventually become a good father? That to me was a fundamentally Christian worldview, and so that led me back to Christianity writ large. But why did I become a Catholic? I mean, there are all these things that I could point to, but one, I really liked that the Catholic Church was just really old. I felt like the modern world was constantly in flux. The things that you believed 10 years ago were no longer even acceptable to believe 10 years later. I liked the fact that I felt like it had stood really strong on some of the core moral issues. I'm a very pro-life person. I've been pro-life since I was 14 years old. But I think anybody who's looked at the history of the American Christian conservative movement would give a lot of credit to the Catholic Church for pushing that movement in a more pro-life direction, especially in the 1970s.
So yeah, that's about 2 years between I liked the philosophy of Catholicism and a lot of Catholics I knew were admirable people, to I started from pro-life and worked my way down from there. Likewise, though, we can see this same pattern playing out in JD's business ventures at the time as well, and specifically those through Narya Capital. For example, back in 2020, Narya's biggest investment came in the form of a $28 million outing for Eastern Kentucky startup App Harvest, a company which specializes in the development and operation of ultra-high-tech food farming greenhouses, promising high-paying, blue-collar jobs with a host of excellent benefits and strict overtime restrictions. The company was slated to be an absolute economic boon for long-suffering rural Kentuckians. The company even boasted significant political support from Kentucky senior senator and maybe worst human being of all time, Mitch McConnell, as seen in this 2021 clip from WKYT TV News in Lexington.
How many decades have we worried about lack of economic development in Eastern Kentucky? And we all know with the decline of the coal industry, it was only got worse. And so this gives us hope.
Now, funny enough, thanks to this fantastic piece from Austin Gaffney at Grist, we know now that App Harvest was basically a giant scam that nearly immediately started subjecting employees to terrible working conditions and forced overtime, before then finally just giving up and turning to underpaid contract labor from undocumented immigrants as a desperate ploy to stop hemorrhaging money. Gaffney even highlights how, in that McConnell speech we saw from before, undocumented laborers were bussed off-site for the day so that Senator Flopjowl wouldn't see them while he made jokes about, I kid you not, taking the tomato market away from the Mexicans. To be fair, though, we all probably should have seen this coming, given that one of the App Harvest's other early investors was none other than Martha Stewart, who at this point is basically known more for picking bad investments than she is, like, I don't know, cooking or crafting or whatever it was she did back in the 90s.
I have noticed, and I'm part of the secular shift to vegetable-based diets here in the United States, and App Harvest fits the bill. the way that they are going to be able to grow vegetables and fruits sustainably, not causing any of the water scarcity and the land degradation and the deforestation that's occurring with regular agriculture here in the States, really, really interests me. And I think that they are riding a wave into the future, and I'm so excited about it.
But massive scandals aside, at least back in 2020, AppHarvest was still seen as a solid and progressive investment, with a promising future and a solid chance to make a big, big difference in the lives of rural Kentuckians. Whereas by May of 2021, JD had Narya investing in the American right wing's favorite YouTube dupe, Rumble, a platform boasting such featured stars as Russell Brand, Tucker Carlson, and prominent conservative podcaster / spousal abuser Steven Crowder.
YouTube, Facebook, they kept telling us what kind of content we were permitted to post. And when we were banned from covering the midterm elections, 2024 kicked off YouTube just a week before happenstance. We broadcast the single largest individual election live stream to occur on any other platform outside of YouTube, doing it through Rumble in the history of the internet. I will stake my reputation on the fact that Rumble believes what they say, and I don't take that lightly.
And just to note, while no one is certain exactly how much this collective of investors, led by none other than JD and his old buddy Peter Thiel, actually invested in Rumble, but sources close to the situation say that they're estimating Rumble's value at over $500 million, so most likely the investment to match that is big as all hell. But yeah, by this time I think we've made it pretty clear that JD had given up all pretense that he was still politically moderate in any capacity, instead now just choosing to lean into far-right ideology in some very direct and very public ways. His online footprint of blogs, speeches, and interviews, well, it all allows us to see the exact same political shift happening in real time. Be it a shift in his political ideology or his political persona, either way, it's well documented. Take, for example, this segment from JD's speech at the 2019 National Conservatism Conference.
In an important way, I believe that conservatives have outsourced our economic and domestic policy thinking to libertarians. And because that's such a loaded word and because labels mean different things to different people, I want to define it as precisely as I can. So if you don't consider yourself a libertarian under this definition, I apologize, you can still use the label, but what I'm going after in my talk is this view that so long as public outcomes and social goods are produced by free individual choices, that we shouldn't be too concerned about what those goods ultimately produce. For example, in Silicon Valley, it is common for neuroscientists to make much more at technology companies like Apple and Facebook, where I think they quite literally are making money addicting our children to devices and applications that warp their brain. They will make more money than neuroscientists who are trying to cure Alzheimer's. And I know a lot of libertarians will say, well, that is the consequence of free choices. That is the consequence of people buying and selling labor on an open market. And so long as there isn't any government coercion in that relationship, we shouldn't be so concerned about it. But what I'm arguing is that conservatives should be concerned about it. We should be concerned that our economy is geared more towards the development of applications than curing terrible diseases, and we should care about a whole host of public goods in addition to that, and actually be willing to use politics and political power to accomplish some of those public goods.
See, once again, 2019, pretty reasonable and balanced, at least by the standards of someone who calls themselves a conservative, right? I mean, he's clearly still at this point aiming for at least some bipartisan appeal. But by April of 2021, JD seemingly moved significantly farther to the political right, signal boosting Trump's claims about election fraud so hard that it actually got him kicked off the board at AppHarvest. And jumping ahead to May of 2021, we have this speech JD gave at the conservative Claremont Institute think tank, where we can see some more of the shift taking place.
My view of what the conservative movement should be about is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. I think that we should fight for the right of every American to live a good life in the country they call their own, to raise a family in dignity on a single middle-class job. Now,
I happen to believe that the biggest obstacle to this, the biggest obstacle to accomplishing this vision is woke capital, which of course is the topic of conversation today. And I believe that those of us on the right need to wake up to what's really going on, because in practice, we have lost, and I hate to sound cynical, I think I'm just being realistic, we have lost nearly every institution in this country that actually matters. We've lost the academy, we have lost the media, we have now lost the government, and we have lost the business and financial institutions too. That's what woke capital is really about. If we're trying to define this term and understand what it means, it's rooted in the fact that the biggest businesses, the most powerful institutions, the most powerful banks in this country have aligned themselves against us.
Notice how JD's tone shifted in that speech. Instead of challenging conservatives to do better for folks like he might have done in the past, now JD's just blending simplified populist rhetoric with an amorphous, confusing obsession with the idea of wokeness. And he seems to be doing it this way just as a means of helping the GOP solidify their strategy on how to fight back against it, instead of offering ways for them to actually improve the party in any meaningful way. And by July of 2021, JD had just fully embraced far-right ideology and rhetoric, as we can see in this clip, which I suspect a few of you have probably seen already.
Look, what I was basically saying is that we're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. And it's just a basic fact. You look at Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children. And how does it make any sense that we've turned our country over to people who don't really have a direct stake in it? I just wanted to ask that question and propose that maybe if we want a healthy ruling class in this country, we should invest more, we should vote more, we should support more people who actually have kids, because those are the people who ultimately have a more direct stake in the future of this country.
Oh, now, just as a quick aside, that may have been the more popular clip with JD talking about his feelings regarding children and political futures and all that, but JD is actually even more intense about this whole child thing than that clip portrays, as we can see in this speech he would give in September of 2021.
But the thing that I want to talk about, the institution I want to take aim at today for the remainder of my remarks, is I want to take aim at the left, specifically the childless left. Because I think the rejection of the American family is perhaps the most pernicious and most evil thing that the left has done in this country. Now let me ask you a question. I'm going to get in trouble for this. This isn't being recorded, is it? Or broadcast live? That's okay. That's all right. I'm going to get in trouble for this.
Cancel me all you want. I don't even think you should be on this freaking darn game if you don't have a microphone. You can cancel me for that, I don't care. It's just my opinion. Go ahead and cancel me.
Consider all of the next gen of the Democrat Party. The names are obvious. They're well-known people. Kamala Harris, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who's now the Secretary of Transportation, Cory Booker, AOC. They're different. They come from different walks of life, different parts of the country. What is the one thing that unites every single one of them? Not a single one of them has any children. Why have we let the Democrat Party become controlled by people who don't have children? And why is this just a normal fact of American life? That the leaders of our country should be people who don't have a personal and direct stake in it via their own offspring, via their own children and grandchildren. It's one thing to recognize that there are people who don't have children through no fault or choice of their own. But it's something else to build a political movement invested theoretically in the future of this country when not a single one of them actually has any physical commitment to the future of this country.
So, at this point, you may be asking yourself, why is this even happening at all? How did this guy who worked so hard to keep distance between himself and the far right all of a sudden end up becoming one of them, and in such a short amount of time, no less? Well, to be fair, I suppose one could argue that this was absolutely telegraphed from the beginning. JD's connections to folks on the right's ideological fringe, like Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin, go all the way back to his time in law school, and even the beloved Hillbilly Elegy tends to lean strongly towards the conservative in its worldview.
I also learned how people gamed the welfare system. They'd buy 24 packs of soda with food stamps and then sell them at a discount for cash. They'd ring up their orders separately, buying food with food stamps, and beer, wine, and cigarettes with cash. They'd regularly go through the checkout line speaking on their cell phones. I could never understood why our lives felt like such a struggle, while those living off of government largesse enjoyed trinkets that I only dreamed about. Mamaw listened intently to my experiences at Dillman's. We began to view much of our fellow working class with mistrust. Most of us were struggling to get by, but we made do, worked hard, and hoped for a better life. But a large minority was content to live off the dole. Every 2 weeks, I'd get a small paycheck and notice the line where federal and state income taxes were deducted from my wages. At least as often, our drug addict neighbor would buy T-bone steaks, which I was too poor to buy for myself but was forced by Uncle Sam to buy for someone else. This was my mindset when I was 17, and though I'm far less angry today than I was then, it was my first indication that the policies of Mamaw's Party of the Working Man, the Democrats, weren't all they were cracked up to be.
Likewise, in 2020, it could be argued that the luster JD once had, being the author of the great Hillbilly Elegy, well, it had started to wear off a little bit. Now, to be fair, criticism of the book's conservative undertones existed even as far back as 2016, the year of its publishing. Yet by 2020, at least from what I could tell, most of the positive sentiments surrounding the book had dried up, replaced with critical think pieces chastising his portrayal of Appalachia and the people who live there for inaccuracy and stereotyping. Criticism of JD in the book ramped up in particular in April of 2020, following the premiere of a Netflix-funded film adaptation of the book made by director Ron Howard that was not received well. Now, personally, I got to watch Hillbilly Elegy with about 70 of my favorite Jennanites at one of our weekly Discord watch parties for patrons and YouTube members. Absolutely a shameless plug. Because in my opinion, this is definitely the definitive way to experience a film like Hillbilly Elegy. Yet even with such an advantage, I must say I can absolutely see what all the critics were complaining about. Ron Howard basically threw out all of the nuance JD put into the book's subjects and replaced it with whatever he considered to be their most dominant trait, but like fully flanderized and cranked up to 11. Mamaw Bonnie was basically just a mishmash of sad moments and surly swearing, alternating between being mean to everyone around her and too weak to control anything that happens to her. JD's liberal professors and Yale peers, in turn, while certainly not the most nuanced characters in the book, were much deeper and more sympathetic than the straight-up Darman level stereotyped bullies that were in the film. And JD's mom, Bev, in the book, a tragic tale of inherited trauma and drug-addled violence, is basically turned into a hyper-abusive villain and walking trigger warning with really no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Oh, and this is just a stylistic gripe. But for some reason, Ron Howard throws out the generally chronological order of the book and replaces it with a Tarantino-style disjointed timeline that makes the whole thing just insanely hard to follow. Now, for what it's worth, the cast was good and for the most part did all right in all of their roles. Amy Adams may have chewed up a bit of the scenery and added a little too much cantankerous energy to some of those scenes, but hey, that's showbiz, baby. Glenn Close, though, even with what little they actually gave her to work with in the script, just does an excellent job at portraying the book's tough yet loving Appalachian Mamaw in a way that feels like it recalls the book well. Although personally, if I ever find myself craving some more Glenn Close, I'll just stick to Mars Attacks or that one scene from Hook. Also, if you've seen Hook and didn't know that was Glenn Close, you're welcome. But all the same, Hillbilly Elegy, the movie, was really nothing special. And without being able to watch it with 70 of my closest friends, I doubt I would have made it more than 10 minutes in. And in turn, watching the movie does have the added benefit of recontextualizing some of the book, too. Drawing out some of the stereotypes and misconceptions that maybe weren't as obvious on a first read-through, and making the whole thing worse for JD overall. Yet while the mainstream media had started to turn on both Hillbilly Elegy and JD's broader portrayal of the region at large, conservative media still held down the fort for him, defending and esteeming the book even through all the new criticism. So yeah, a move like this would seem like a good business decision, at least from a PR perspective. Lean into the crowd that's still receptive to your message, in this case the conservatives, and likewise discard and chastise all of those with whom you've lost favor. It makes perfect sense and explains all of this honestly, except no it doesn't, because there is a third variable at work here, and that third variable's name is Peter Thiel. See, because Peter Thiel's not the kind of guy to just give some kid from the sticks like JD a cushy, lucrative, do-nothing job that also conveniently opens up a bunch of time for memoir writing without expecting something in return. And see, there is something that Peter Thiel desperately wanted at this point in his life. Specifically, it seems like Peter Thiel, more than anything in the world, wanted a senator that he could call his very own. And it is that pursuit which will take us into our next chapter. So, to explain in a little more detail what I was talking about back there, as far as I can tell, Peter Thiel has been very interested for a very long time in placing one of his acolytes, or I guess you could say a politician in his own image, into some of our country's highest legislative bodies. And specifically, he does this for what seems like the purposes of damaging and undermining the entire democratic process with a parade of highly divisive far-right rhetoric. Peter has been backing provocative conservative candidates for well over a decade at this point, with financial ties to Ted Cruz stretching as far back as 2009, specifically a $250,000 donation towards his campaign for Texas State Attorney General that year, and then further undisclosed donations towards his various Senate campaigns. Likewise, Peter has also provided strikingly similar financial support to Missouri's former Attorney General and current Senator Josh Hawley, donating $300,000 in total donations towards his Attorney General campaign, and again, additional undisclosed donations towards his 2018 Senate campaign. And Peter's not afraid to jump into presidential politics either, as evidenced in 2012 when he hinged his bets on Libertarian presidential candidate Ron Paul, funding the Paul campaign to the tune of $1.7 million. And then, in 2016, he would drop $1.25 million on the Trump presidential campaign, far earlier and far more money than most anyone was willing to give Trump at that time. Now, Peter distanced himself from the 2020 Trump campaign, instead testing out the waters of the U.S. Senate again with a $2 million donation towards the ultimately failed campaign of Chris Kobach in Kansas. And all of that would lead to Peter's biggest political donation salvo to date, the 2022 midterm election cycle, in which Peter would drop over $30 million combined across the entire slate of national races. During this cycle in particular, Peter would target around 15 to 20 races, with a combined $25 million in PAC donations. Peter particularly focused on providing financial support to candidates with established track records of claiming that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump through mass voter fraud. And personally, to me, this seems like a pretty obvious attempt by Peter to enact Curtis Yarvin's ideologies in the real world, namely installing sycophants who support Donald Trump's brash claims of election fraud in hopes of bolstering his eventual unchecked dictatorship on down the road. And just for reference, by 2022, J.D. Vance was very public about his support for Donald Trump's election fraud claims.
So big tech basically did two things, I think, to rig the 2020 election. The first is that they basically censored negative information about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, and they promoted negative information about President Trump. But the bigger and more catastrophic thing that they did is that Zuckerberg put $420 million into controlling these local boards of elections. And if you think about this, these local boards of elections should be accountable to the people. They should not be doing the bidding of a single tech oligarch to effectively buy votes for the Democrat Party. But that is what happened. The more that we learn about this, the more that we realize that basically one of the wealthiest and most powerful people in our society went full bore with the left and used that wealth and that power to buy votes for Democrats. If that's not rigging an election, I don't know what the term even means.
However, Peter would save his most consequential political experiment for this 2022 midterm cycle as well. Namely, and for lack of any better phrasing, an attempt to outright buy 2 U.S. Senate seats. The first of these attempts would come in the form of Arizona Republican candidate Blake Masters, a longtime Teal protege and business partner that I seriously suspect may just be a Tim Robinson bit taken way too far.
What the fuck is this world? What have they done to us? What did they do to us?
All kidding aside though, Peter and Blake go way, way back. The two first met while Peter was a guest lecturer at Stanford Law School. Blake posted his notes from the class online, which the two would later compile into a book called 0 to 1. And from there, Blake would take on further roles with the Thiel enterprise, specifically becoming the COO of Yale Capital and the president of the Thiel Foundation charity. Blake would resign all of these positions in early 2022 to focus on his next endeavor, running for the Republican nomination for Senate in Arizona. Peter would back Blake's Senate run with an unprecedented $15 million in donations, more than he had ever given a single candidate before. And Blake would easily clear the primaries with this incredible cash infusion from Peter. But after that, it became pretty clear pretty quick that Blake was far too legitimately crazy to survive a general election, as we can see in this clip here.
I want to ask you as the last question, the question of the show. This is a question everyone gets on the show. Do you have a subversive thinker, living or dead, could be a writer, could be even a business person, that you think people should look up, look into, know more about, that's, underrated and would influence people in a good direction?
Subversive thinker that's underrated?
Yeah.
I'll probably get in trouble for saying this.
I
mean, I'd say, how about like Theodore Kaczynski?
Good one. Actually, yeah.
Weird. I'll be honest, I thought he was going to say Peter Thiel there. I swear, where have I heard that name before? Theodore Kaczynski. Where have I heard it? I can't call it to mind.
11 weeks after he was arrested at the Montana shack he called home, Ted Kaczynski stands formally accused tonight of being the so-called Unabomber. In Sacramento, California, correspondent Bill Whitaker has the story.
The indictment came after Theodore Kaczynski had spent 2 months in a Montana jail, charged only with possessing bomb components. The Sacramento grand jury slapped Kaczynski with 10 charges of transporting, mailing, and using explosives with intent to kill or injure.
Oh yeah, now I remember who Theodore Kaczynski is. Theodore Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski for short, or the Unabomber if you're nasty, I guess. But really, though, the rest of Blake's time on the campaign trail was just as loop-de-loop as the whole Unabomber thing, and overall, this whole experiment was just a giant waste of Peter's money. In the end, Blake would end up losing the general election to current Arizona Senator, former astronaut, one-time potential VP pick himself, and part-time Mr. Clean impersonator Mark Kelly. Likewise, it seems like Peter's results in the House of Representatives that year were pretty middling as well. Notably, he seemed to find success in helping put several incumbent Republicans back into their House seats for new terms, but he struggled to get any new folks into Congress. Except, not entirely. Because you remember how I said that Peter was trying to buy 2 Senate seats that year? Well, one of them was the failed campaign of Blake Masters in Arizona. But the other campaign Peter bet big on in 2022 was the extremely successful campaign of J.D. Vance in Ohio. And what's more, where Blake Masters was completely unable to hide his crazy for the general election, J.D. was instead able to effectively blend his 2016 populist author persona with his 2021 MAGA mentality to form a reasonably effective modern Republican hybrid type candidate.
Mr. Vance, you have said as far back as July you believe the nation is already in a recession. You blame that on reckless Democratic spending. However, some of these policies, including the infrastructure bill, will provide tens of billions of dollars for things in Ohio like clean water, airports, and highways. Do you think some of that money is well spent?
Well, of course, some of the money is well spent, but when we're talking about $6 trillion, there's a lot of money that isn't well spent, and that's fundamentally the problem with what we've seen out of the Biden administration, is simultaneously they've borrowed and spent trillions of dollars that we just don't have, and that's thrown fuel on the fire of the inflation problem, and at the same time, they've completely gone to war against America's energy sector, and you can't do both of those things at the same time. They're each bad ideas, but when you do both of them at the same time, you're going to get record inflation, which is exactly what you expect to get. Now, Tim Ryan, of course, has supported all of these policies 100% of the time. And this really is the contrast on these economic issues between Tim Ryan and myself. I believe we've gone in a fundamentally bad direction over the last couple of years. I think people deserve to go to the grocery store without it completely breaking the bank. Tim Ryan has voted with these policies 100% of the time. Every single time he gets an opportunity to stand up for Ohioans, he chooses to bend the knee to his own party.
Likewise, JD also benefited from an unusually aggressive and chaotic field of other candidates in that year's GOP primary, giving JD the opportunity to look like the cool-headed adult in a room full of bickering children, as we can see in this clip from the AP.
No, you don't.
I do.
You've never been in the private sector in your
All right,
entire
I've
life.
worked, sir.
Josh. Squat. About
2 tours in Iraq. Don't tell me I haven't worked. Don't tell me I haven't worked.
You don't know squat.
It's okay, right?
You don't know squat.
2 tours in Iraq. Don't tell me I haven't worked.
Back off, buddy. You're gonna
You back off.
Come on. Never that'll happen.
Sit down.
Never.
Watch.
Yeah.
Watch.
We'll square it away with the wrong dude.
No, you're dealing with the wrong guy. You watch what happens. You watch what happens. All right, guys.
And according to Jonathan Swan and Maggie Haberman at the New York Times, this debate performance was likely instrumental in securing JD a coveted primary endorsement from Donald Trump. And on top of all of that, JD's opponent, Tim Ryan, a center-left Democrat working and failing to court an extremely blue-collar state, was struggling under the weight of Ohio's shifting political climate and discontent with national Democratic leadership. So in the end, JD seized on this weakness and was able to squeak out a key victory for himself, the GOP, and the Teal machine all at once. For real, when I say squeaked out a victory, though, I mean that only sort of pejoratively. JD did win his election by a respectable 6-point margin, beating his modest pre-election poll expectations. However, he was also the lowest performing Republican winner in all of Ohio that year. But hey, a win is a win, and semantics be damned, JD was going to the U.S. Senate, specifically to be sworn in alongside the rest of the 118th Congress on January 3rd of 2023. And as one might expect from such a prolific political go-getter, JD wasted no time jumping straight into the Washington fray. Per Harry Lee at Spectrum News, we know that as of late July 2024, JD had sponsored 57 bills, though none of these have yet made it to Biden's desk, and he co-sponsored an additional 288 bills, a whopping 2 of which made it to Biden's desk before being promptly vetoed. Likewise, JD has demonstrated a teeny bit more interest in bipartisanship than most of the GOP would at this point in the country's history. Working with Democrats like Senator Raphael Warnock on things like insulin price protections and Senator Elizabeth Warren on things like CEO pay caps. But of course, like any good modern Republican, JD also has taken plenty of time for some good old-fashioned pointless Senate floor grandstanding, as we can see in this extremely helpful compilation from Forbes.
I have my views on the transgender ideology question. In particular, I really worry that we are going too far, too fast, not in support of the evidence, prescribing treatments and surgeries and hormonal therapies that could damage children for years. I think we need to be patient with this, and we need to follow the science. This is why, by the way, most of our European allies, Sweden, for example, a country hailed as a great example of good health care 10 years ago by many Democrats in this chamber, is going the opposite direction of where we're going on the transgender ideology question. Now let's ask ourselves how they treat the former Republican president in the face of a classified document scandal where literally the claim is that the president of the United States mishandled the documents of his own administration. Now, nobody doubts that President Trump had the right to declassify the documents at issue in this case. The argument is that he didn't, and therefore they want to throw him in jail. Is that really what we're doing at the height of a presidential campaign, is trying to throw the former president in jail, the likely leader of the opposition in prison because he didn't cross the T's and dot the I's? Now, much is made about the political prosecution of Donald Trump. I think that is unjustified, and it is frankly scary in the world's greatest democracy to have the political opposition leader prosecuted by the sitting president. That's pretty weird.
And I mean, really, otherwise, he hasn't had much time to do anything of note beyond that. At time of recording, he's been an actual senator for about 18 months or so. That's like barely enough time to figure out where the bathroom is, let alone to make any lasting change. And under normal circumstances, this is probably where our story would end for the day. Truth be told, under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't be making an episode about J.D. Vance at all. But of course, we don't live in anything that even vaguely resembles normal times anymore. And in turn, JD managed to make a believer out of at least one very important and very consequential American political figure. Which is how, despite his lack of experience, clout, name recognition, or reasonable opinions, we as a country ended up in this position on July 15th of 2024.
Let us go to Dana Bash about what is going on right now.
Well, we now have the former president's pick, and it is J.D. Vance, the 39-year-old freshman senator from the state of Ohio.
Let me just read, if I can read. So we have this announcement is that Donald Trump truth socialed it. After lengthy deliberation and thought, and considering the tremendous talents of many others, I have decided that the person best suited to assume the position of Vice President of the United States is Senator J.D. Vance of the great state of Ohio.
So, sitting here near the end of this story, I think we can all probably at this point agree that, if nothing else, JD's path to riding shotgun with the devil the way he is now, well, it's been odd. Like, let's ignore all of his terrible ideology for a second and just look at this from a purely strategic perspective. JD is essentially a moderately successful author and a TV pundit with another decade of disjointed experience across both legal work and venture capital. He's been victorious in precisely one election for public office in his entire life. Now, I know it was a U.S. Senate election, which is impressive, but even then, it still took a Herculean amount of Peter Thiel's money for him to even limp across the finish line. And at least at this point, it's not like his time in the Senate has been particularly memorable either. I guess he sounds a bit less wackadoo than some of his GOP colleagues, but he still espouses all the same wackadoo shit all the same, all while simultaneously having accomplished nothing in terms of actual governance. His deviations from the horrible, oppressive modern platform of the GOP, well, they're performative and ineffective at best. And for the most part, he's just been a Republican yes man and a rubber stamp for the worst parts of the Trump agenda. By the standards of Washington, D.C., J.D. Vance was a complete nobody, right up until the moment he became the potential presidential successor to a 78-year-old man whose diet consists of McDonald's and Diet Coke, and whose only exercise is rigorous tax evasion. And that's not even to get into J.D.'s age. At the time of this recording, he will have just turned 40 years old. He's the first millennial ever on a major party U.S. presidential ticket, and if elected, he would become the youngest vice president since Richard Nixon in 1953, who, I feel the need to point out, also had about triple the government experience that JD does right now, despite being a year younger at the time. Now, don't get me wrong, I want my generation represented in the government as much as possible. I think we're capable, and I think it's our time. But I mean, I was really hoping for somebody with a bit more flair to be the first millennial on a presidential ticket, you know? I mean, I swear to God, honestly, Usha seems like she would be a much better candidate. Why didn't they just pick her? Well, to be fair, we'll be getting to why they didn't just pick her, but you get what I'm saying.
Well, I was lucky in that I grew up with incredibly loving parents who came from a different country. They came voluntarily, they came legally, and they made a life for themselves in a place where there were tons of other immigrants, all of whom had different paths to getting there, but really shared a view that this was the country that they wanted to be in, and that this was a place that they really wanted their children to grow up in, to build a future in, and to really become a part of the fabric of American society. So I think that's great. That is a wonderful thing.
And yeah, this election cycle was certainly calling for a bit of youthful energy to balance out all the octogenarian mustiness, so that's something. But with all of this taken into consideration, I still feel like most of the country just agreed from the moment he was announced that J.D. Vance was a weird choice for vice president, right? And see, all that would have been true even if everything had gone super well for JD in this formal alliance with the Trump team. But now, less than a month removed from the announcement itself, we know that things have not gone very well at all for vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance. For starters, that childless cat lady clip from before, it went viral nearly immediately after J.D. accepted the VP nomination. It was already a bad soundbite even with Joe at the top of the Democratic ticket, but once he stepped down and handed the reins to current U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, who was directly named and insulted in J.D.'s remarks, well, the whole thing went from being just bad to being absolutely devastating. And I want to be freaking clear on just how gross what JD said here was. Because the thing is, Kamala Harris does have 2 stepchildren, just like Pete Buttigieg has 2 adopted children.
Harris does have children, 2 adult stepchildren, Cole and Ella, who were 19 and 15 when she married Doug Emhoff in 2014.
We have a very modern family.
Their blended family, she has joked, is almost a little too functional, which she credits to the close friendship she has with Emhoff's first wife, whom she calls an incredible mother.
One of the keys to my relationship with Cole and Ella is their mom.
Ella Emhoff says their family dynamics work. They are really a unit, like a 3-person parenting squad. It's really cool, creating a modern political family.
The thing about blended families, if everyone approaches it in the way that there's plenty of love to share, then it works.
But to J.D. Vance, it doesn't seem to count unless there's DNA involved, which is particularly ironic and hypocritical coming from him, given just how many folks, blood-related or otherwise, were involved in the village that raised him. Like, yeesh, bro, I mean, I have a deadbeat dad too, so I get daddy issues, seriously. But at least I'm not taking my trauma out on the entire country like this. To be fair though, my stepdad frickin' rules, and I love him very much, so maybe that changes things a bit. Likewise though, JD also attempted to acknowledge some of the awful racist attacks his wife Usha had been facing at the hands of his party's well-established white supremacist sector, and he could not have bungled that any harder if he tried.
It's just so disgusting, Megan. And look, I love my wife so much. I love her because she's who she is. Obviously, she's not a white person, and we've been attacked by some white supremacists over that. But I love Usha. She's such a good mom. She's such a brilliant lawyer, and I'm so proud of her.
Good Lord, how did Usha not just veto this entire thing before it even sprouted legs? And also, say better stuff about your wife, you dingus! And less than a week from the time of recording, JD stepped in it yet again while trying to tell a story about his son on the Full Send podcast.
My son, who's 7, is in the hotel room with me. So he's trying to talk to me about Pikachu. And I'm on the phone with Donald Trump. And I'm like, son, shut the hell up for 30 seconds about Pikachu. This is the most important phone call of my life.
Okay, first of all, there's no reason to talk to your kid that way. Second of all, if you do talk to your kid that way, the best approach is to apologize, rectify your behavior, and move on. Not to try it like some fun, relatable story for political points on a podcast. And third of all, that's a pretty strong sentiment about collectible card games from you, JD, admitted former Magic the Gathering player. As a former level 1 tournament judge with 2 whole tournaments to his name. Yes, that's something I actually did back in the day. Well, I'm pretty sure I still have the authority and the responsibility to issue you, J.D. Vance, a tournament violation for unsportsmanlike conduct. Yeah, take that. But really, it's gotten so bad for JD at this point that people just kind of believe any bad thing about him now. Like, for real. They believe anything about him. Like, seriously. Any bad, potentially career-wrecking news story involving J.D. Vance, people will just pounce on without a second thought anymore. All right, fine, we're going to talk about the couch fucking thing now. So, to start off, right up front, I want to say that the couch sex thing did not happen. Funny as all hell, we all wanted it to be true, but it just flat is not a real thing that ever took place. The story was a fabrication posted for laughs on Twitter that unfortunately made itself appear far too credible to readers with no intention of following up. But it's gotten to the point now that, per Catherine Long at Business Insider, 1 out of every 7 searches for J.D. Vance has some variation of the word couch or sofa included. And really, in our modern political environment, his lack of ability to control the story says more about JD than anything else. Honestly, he might have been better off if he'd actually just fucked the couch, because at least that would have been an engaging story. So yeah, all of that is really bad on its face, especially given the fact that the guy hasn't even been the VP nominee for an entire month yet. But what's more, JD's past as a liberal-friendly author and potential political fraud, well, those are starting to rise to the surface now as well, in case this whole video wasn't enough evidence of that for you to begin with. I mean, some of it was bound to happen though, right? Lord knows I wouldn't be reading this man's stupid memoir if it wasn't for the fact that he very well might be running my country soon. And as always, it seems like we can blame the GOP and their famously soft vetting process for signing off on this troublesome pick without doing all the proper research into just how much baggage he'd be bringing along with him. And yet, it all goes deeper than that now, too. Meet Sophia Nelson, a public defender in Detroit, a courageous transgender activist, and most dramatically, a former law school colleague and friend of JD's. See, while JD has been out here towing the Republican Party line of violence and oppression towards trans people like he does all of their terrible ideologies anymore, Sophia had seen a different side of JD in college. They knew a JD that, while admittedly on the conservative side of things, cared for people and didn't use hateful vitriol when he spoke. They knew a JD that could debate and process political ideas without filtering it all through a MAGA lens. They knew a JD that brought them homemade baked goods after their gender confirmation surgery, for crying out loud. And above all else, they knew that, thanks to a bunch of old emails where JD showed a very different side of himself, they were actually in a position to expose all of this to the world at a time where it really needed exposure.
So one of your emails from him, this never before published, Vance says in November of 2016, and I quote, "I really see the racially offensive views of Trump's supporters, not all of them, of course, but it's certainly disproportionate, as coexisting rather than driving his support." I guess let me just ask the question to you this way, Sophia, then, because this is an email and you had many conversations with him. Did Vance believe that Donald Trump himself was racist?
My understanding is that he certainly did, yes.
And so, you know, do you recall any of the conversations you had, the two of you, on topics like that?
I mean, in a series of emails that I've shared with you, he's called Trump morally reprehensible, a very bad man, and he indicated that he wishes Trump would tone down the racism. That all indicates to me that Vance was well aware that Trump trafficked in racism. There is extreme undertones of prejudice, racism, transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia that drive the MAGA movement, and is now something that J.D. Vance himself is trafficking in.
And of course, none of that gets into all of the problems that Trump himself is causing for both JD and the GOP at large during this election cycle.
Some of your own supporters, including Republicans on Capitol Hill, have labeled Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the first Black and Asian American woman to serve as vice president and be on a major party ticket, as a DEI hire. Is that acceptable language to you? And will you tell those Republicans and those supporters to stop it?
How do you define DEI? Go ahead. How do you define
diversity, equity, inclusion?
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Is that what your definition?
That is
give me a
literally
definition
the words
then. Would you give me a definition
DEI.
of that? Give me a definition.
Sir,
of
I'm
that.
asking you a question,
No,
a
you
very
have to
direct
define
question.
it. Define it for me, if you
I
would.
just defined it, sir. Do you believe that Vice President Kamala Harris is only on the ticket because she is a Black woman?
Well, I can say no. I think it's maybe a little bit different. So, I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly, very much, and she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was Black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black.
Yeah, JD, I'm sure you can make things way better for your Appalachian brethren by putting that guy in charge, right? Obviously, just such a great politician to stake your entire livelihood, career, and reputation on. And so yeah, now in August of 2024, just 3 short months removed from the presidential election, this is the state of things for J.D. Vance. And as we close things out, I think it's time we take a little autopsy of all this. Why was J.D. chosen for the VP nomination at all? Why in God's name did he accept it? And where the hell do we go from here? Well, I'm going to start off with the first question I asked there because I think it's the easiest to answer. Strategically speaking, JD was probably chosen for a few reasons. For one, he is a senator from Ohio, a famously contentious battleground state with a ton of electoral votes. Electoral votes, which are now much more likely to go to Trump regardless of any of the gaffs or the scandals or the other nonsense going on. People just like picking their hometown guy regardless of how much he sucks, and in a contest like this one, that can have big consequences. Of course, JD's relatively young age was also a big factor here. It's pretty obvious that the Republicans wanted to get the first millennial ever on a presidential ticket at a time where the 2 presidential candidates were both historically old as hell. And it seems like that desperation may have led to some recklessness in the vetting and selection process. And of course, the whole thing backfired spectacularly with Joe Biden stepping down and the subsequent rise of a much younger and more energetic Kamala Harris to the top of the Democratic ticket. Which is particularly hilarious, in my opinion at least, because I'm pretty sure his age was the reason that GOP party leadership signed off on JD. But truly, above all else, it's my opinion, at least, that J.D. Vance was chosen for this role because he appealed very greatly and very directly to Donald Trump himself, and in the worst ways imaginable. I mean, some of it is probably pretty obvious by now. JD was on conservative TV a lot in the period from 2017 to 2022, looking presentable and sounding, well, probably smarter than most of the folks that were on there at the time. And we know that Trump learns basically everything about the world around him from conservative TV. JD simply had years to build clout directly with Donald in a way that few other VP candidates could. I mean, for reference, right when Donald made his first surprise endorsement of JD during that 2022 GOP primary in Ohio, his other big endorsement for that cycle was Mehmet Oz. Donald Trump likes TV stars because he was a TV star. It really is as simple as that. And JD was the closest he was going to get to having a fellow TV star on the ticket with him. But of course, it goes deeper than that. Let's take another look at that New York Times article from before, the one written by Jonathan Swan and Maggie Haberman, to see just how deeply and pathetically JD was willing to sell himself out for Trump's approval. The meeting got off to a bad start. J.D. Vance walked into Donald Trump's office at Mar-a-Lago on a warm winter afternoon in February 2021. The former president had a thick stack of papers on his desk, printouts of Mr. Vance's copious broadsides against Mr. Trump. Mr. Vance's past criticisms had included an essay in one of Trump's least favorite magazines, The Atlantic, where Mr. Vance described Trump as cultural heroin, a purveyor of false promises to the white working class. Mr. Trump, using an expletive, bluntly told Mr. Vance, "You said some nasty stuff about me." The discussion that followed was described in detail by 2 people with knowledge of the meeting who insisted on anonymity to talk about a private conversation. Mr. Vance's next move was crucial. This was the first time he was meeting Mr. Trump, and Mr. Vance needed the former president to like him or at least leave the meeting with an open mind. Mr. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy, a best-selling memoir about his troubled upbringing and the struggles and pathologies of the white working class, was running for the open U.S. Senate seat in Ohio as a Republican populist, a never-Trumper turned pro-Trumper. Mr. Vance decided to immediately apologize. He told Mr. Trump that he had bought into what he described as media lies and that he was sorry he got it wrong. Of all people, Mr. Vance told Mr. Trump, Mr. Vance himself should have understood. Mr. Trump agreed, telling Mr. Vance that he should have understood because Mr. Vance had written the Hillbilly Elegy book. His implication that Mr. Vance should have supported him because Mr. Trump's own base of non-college educated voters, angry about globalization, immigration, and foreign wars, were exactly the people Mr. Vance purported to represent. At that point, Mr. Trump seemed disarmed, and the meeting went on for almost 2 hours. They discussed the 2020 election and the Ohio race, but mostly they talked about the difficulties of politics. It had been less than a month since Mr. Trump left the White House a pariah in the wake of a pro-Trump mob storming the Capitol after the president had spent 2 months lying about a stolen election. Mr. Trump closed the conversation by asking Mr. Vance what he wanted. Mr. Trump told him that everyone else had already been down to Mar-a-Lago begging for his endorsement, a reference to Mr. Vance's potential opponents in the Ohio Senate primary. Mr. Vance, who, along with a spokesman for Mr. Trump, declined to comment for the article, told the former president he wasn't going to do that. Mr. Trump, surprised, asked Mr. Vance if he wanted the endorsement. Mr. Vance said that of course he wanted it, but that Mr. Trump should let him run his race and see how he did. Mr. Vance said he would not be the type of candidate who would attack the former president when the media came after him. Mr. Trump seemed intrigued. "All right," Mr. Trump replied, telling Mr. Vance, whom he called JD, to take care and check in from time to time. That wasn't as good, but you get the idea. Mr. Trump had relatively little personal contact with Mr. Vance after that first meeting, but he took note as Mr. Vance kicked off his Senate campaign in July of 2021, ran circles around his primary opponents in debates, and became a frequent presence on Tucker Carlson Tonight, at the time the top-rated show on cable television. Mr. Trump was impressed. He told allies he thought Mr. Vance was smart and handsome. "Those beautiful blue eyes," he'd say repeatedly. "Great on TV and a killer at the debates." Mr. Trump, who split with allies at the influential conservative group Club for Growth in backing Mr. Vance, felt validated when Mr. Vance won the general election against his Democratic rival, Representative Tim Ryan, and then immediately became one of Mr. Trump's most vocal supporters in the Senate. When Mr. Trump announced his third campaign for president in November 2022, at a time when most Republicans wanted nothing to do with him, Mr. Vance distinguished himself by immediately signaling to Mr. Trump's staff that Mr. Vance was all in. Okay, so ignoring that whole beautiful blue eyes part because it weirds me the hell out, I think now we can see clearly the mechanism behind JD's ascension to the vice presidential nomination. His absolute and unflinching willingness to sell his soul for people in power. See, for all of JD's accomplishments and for all of the things he had to do to get to where he is today, JD has also made it oddly and abundantly clear that he has never truly believed in himself as a person who can make positive change. I think that JD decided early on that without the benefaction of time, effort, and resources from his betters, namely in this case people of extreme wealth, power, and status, he was never going to amount to anything. It's why he attached himself to people like Usha in college. It's why he became the subject of Peter Thiel's political puppet experiment. Hell, I think it's why he's given up his immortal soul to the all-encompassing Big Daddy God of Catholicism. And it's why, despite every reason a capable person like him should have to the contrary, J.D. Vance decided that his best shot to save his country and his kinfolk was to attach himself like a sad barnacle to this awful, disgusting whale that is the 2024 Trump presidential campaign. See, deep down, I believe, or maybe I just really want to believe, that J.D. Vance does truly and deeply care about folks who came from circumstances like his own. Things like poverty, abuse, and the generational marginalization those things can lead to. And I think that J.D. really wants, or at least wanted, to use the government, as he should, to ease the burdens of people like that. At this point, I feel like I just can't unread Hillbilly Elegy. I can't unhear Sophia Nelson's words about their former friend. I myself have heard J.D. Vance speak far too many words of complexity, nuance, compassion, and deep critical thought that it's really hard for me to believe he sees the whole world in shades of MAGA red now. Now, don't get me wrong. J.D. Vance has clearly given up on decency. And for that alone, it really doesn't matter whether he believes this stuff or not. Saying the things he does, supporting the legislation he supports, all of that is reason enough alone for you to despise J.D. Vance as a legislator and truthfully as a human being. He's on the wrong side of history for basically every issue that exists in our modern politics, whether or not his internal opinions are more nuanced than his public ones. Likewise, if elected alongside Donald Trump, JD will absolutely support his entire agenda, along with the whole GOP and their draconian coup known as the Project 2025 plan, which if things go according to plan, I will be covering next month. I know that's highly requested too, so just give me a little bit of time. But at the end of the day, whether or not JD's fringe internet conservative beliefs make him believe he's acting in the best interest of the country by aligning himself with Trump, all of his efforts in that role would go to policy and action that would make life on this entire planet much, much worse for everyone who's not an American billionaire. And the thing is, I, at this point, don't really know and probably never will know if JD actually believes in all of this, or if he's just trying to play along with Curtis Yarvin's version of dictatorial social change, and hoping to attach his quote-unquote good ideas onto all of the other trash that Trump would inevitably do in the presidential role. And either way, we all know Americans are going to end up getting screwed in the deal. So yeah, I don't really friggin' care about JD's motivations anymore. And I also want to highlight that even if he could improve the lives of Appalachians this way, he can't, but hypothetically if he could, even then all he's shown us is just how far he's willing to go in marginalizing, oppressing, and disregarding America's most vulnerable populations in order to help those select few folks who are important to him directly. But all of that aside, I came here to try and crack the code on J.D. Vance. And after reading and watching everything I have, I just cannot help but feel that I'm looking at someone who knows they're doing something truly awful and becoming a monster they never intended to be. But for whatever reason, thinks that that's the only way he can make positive change for the people he cares about. I think under normal circumstances, JD's persistent perception of personal inadequacy would, like Hillbilly Elegy itself, be nothing more than a tragic and sympathetic byproduct of JD's upbringing, and that overall he would have lived a life as a semi-consequential yet ultimately forgettable TV pundit. But we don't live in normal times. And because JD has ironically climbed so far and accomplished so much even in the face of obvious self-esteem issues, he's now poised to put himself in a position to start ruining a lot of people's lives very, very quickly. Basically taking out his rage on his own insecurities on the entire country. And now, as such, forcing all of us to keep him under a very, very hot spotlight. And so now, what do we do with all of this? Well, I think all we need to do is just work together to make sure everyone knows how gross J.D. Vance is. And we need to be doing it as often as possible for about the next 3 months or so. Honestly, it might be kind of fun because I really believe this is one of the few moments in modern American politics where we might actually be able to make big consequential change here. J.D. is weird and problematic, and knowing more about him might actually have the chance to push people away from the Trump ticket. I don't know, man, I'm just really trying to be hopeful here. And regardless, I want more people to know who Peter Teal is, and how he straight up bought J.D. Vance a Senate seat. I want J.D. to know how embarrassing it is for him that people are starting to piece his story together. For them to see just how much he has twisted and warped himself for the pleasure of his billionaire benefactors. I want people asking JD questions about why he sold out the people of Appalachia, people like his beloved Mamaw, and all for a supposed billionaire who, clear as day, never once in his life has given a damn about people like her. Hell, if I had my way, this is what your next JD Vance rally would sound like. And you know what? We might even be seeing the real end, because now JD has lost the one thing that kept him afloat. Because see, Peter Teal is staying out of the 2024 election. So now he has to do it all on his own. And J.D. Vance hasn't made a big habit of doing things on his own now, has he? So yeah, most of all, I just want all of you to go out and tell everybody you know just how weird and strange and stupid J.D. Vance and his VP nomination are. I want you to tell as many people as possible, especially if there's any chance that they might vote for Trump and you feel safe doing so. Because truly, with this election so close and everything so contested, this might be a very viable angle of attack for folks on the ground. We might actually be able to do some big electoral good just by talking shit, and we won't even need 10 million Teal bucks to pull it off either. So yeah, now that you know the story, go out there and spread the bad word of J.D. Vance. Let everyone know he sucks, let everyone know all the reasons he sucks, and for the next 3 months, just go crazy with it. And in the meantime, you all have a good night, and I'll see you next time. All right, another one down. Perhaps my biggest requested episode to date. Thank you all so much for giving me the time to work on this. Obviously, it's a relatively new developing story, and I had to throw it together pretty quick, but I'm real happy with what we talked about here today. I think we've had a real good time, and I hope you all have too. I wanted to take a quick second to address something that Jen's talked about, but I haven't actually gotten to say anything about yet. Recently, our 10-year-old dachshund Elvis, who a lot of you might know from his many appearances on the channel, he passed away under really sudden and awful circumstances. Jen's posted about it on Instagram if you want to know more details. I'm going to try and preserve my eyeballs and not talk about that. But suffice it to say, our little guy died, and it was really brutal. But I also want to say that because of you all, because of our patrons and our YouTube members and all the people who buy merch and honestly just watch our videos and deal with the advertisements, because of you people and all you've done for us, we got a chance to see our little guy off to heaven the right way, cuddled in our arms and quietly off to sleep. We got to run every test we could imagine to know what was going on and to understand exactly what was best for our little guy. And 5 years ago, when we didn't have you folks, that wouldn't have happened. So, from the bottom of my heart, for the rest of my life, thank you all so much. Now I'm going to wipe my eyes to finish this up. I'm sorry, that's the first and only time I plan to say something public. Thank y'all for listening. And in the meantime, I don't want to make it about this, I swear, but if you like what we do here and you really appreciate the videos we put out, the Patreon, the YouTube memberships, that type of stuff, it's our lifeline. It's how we pay our bills. It's how we were able to get through that terrible situation. It's not just some faceless corporation. It's the two people you see in these videos that benefit, and I just want everyone to know that. In the meantime, I'm not kidding y'all, though. We have some of the best stuff, the best videos, the best topics we've ever had lined up for the next few months. Through the end of the year, we're going full speed. We know it's one of the most intense political seasons we've ever faced on the channel. There's more going on than perhaps there has been in decades. I don't know. And we plan to comment on it all. We want you all to be able to watch our videos and find out about what's going on, and have a little fun with it and have it be a little more easy to approach and not quite as scary. So keep your eyes on us. We got a lot of cool stuff coming. It's going to be awesome. And in the meantime, I always say, do something kick-ass this weekend. I don't know what it would be. I've already told you to talk shit about J.D. Vance. I don't know. This is a free week. You're a free American citizen. You do something kick-ass, but you get to choose what it is. I'm brain-fried and still crying a little bit. So anyway, I love you all so much. Thank you for watching these videos, for supporting us, for everything you do. And thank you for just being the most amazing people on earth. Good night, and I'll see you next time.
Are you a racist? Do you hate Mexicans? I'm J.D. Vance, and I approve this message.